This video is a follow-on from the previous video concerned with blame, in which I talked about the policies implemented by central banks regarding interest rates. The other lever that the central banks are in charge of is the money supply lever, so let's look at that. Central banks have increased the money supply, which has caused the inflation we see today. Inflation is defined in classical economics as an increase in the money supply, although more correctly it should be referred to as currency creation, because there's an important difference between money and currency, but I won't go into that here. For those of you who are more visually orientated, it might be helpful to think of inflation as being a balloon. We can call the balloon the money supply. To inflate an ordinary balloon, we need to add air. With our money supply balloon, it inflates when more currency is added into the economy. In accord with this analogy, when the central banks push the money supply lever, more currency is added into the system. The money supply balloon inflates. Increasing the money supply is not good for a currency. It devalues or debases the currency. A devaluation is obviously a loss of value, although more correctly we should say that the currency has lost its purchasing power. Purchasing power is the ability of a currency to pay for goods and services. A good analogy that might help people understand the notion of purchasing power is to think of a weightlifter lifting barbells. How much weight a weightlifter can lift depends on how strong he is, or to put it another way, how powerful he is. If the weightlifter is strong and powerful, he will be able to lift a lot. If the weightlifter is not so strong and powerful, he won't be able to lift quite so much. If the weightlifter is weak, he won't be able to lift anywhere near as much as a weightlifter who is strong and powerful. This is common sense. The same is true with regard to a currency. If the currency is strong and powerful, it will be able to purchase a lot. If the currency is weak, it won't be able to purchase much at all. So, when the purchasing power of a currency decreases, the ability of that currency to pay for goods and services decreases. We see an increase in prices of products during an inflationary period because it takes more currency to buy the product as compared to before. In economics, everything is relative. With inflation, essentially what happens is the currency has lost some of its purchasing power in relation to the product. After all, the product itself hasn't changed. Milk is still milk. What has changed is the value of the currency. The loss in purchasing power means that it takes more currency to buy that same product. The currency has depreciated in relation to that product. Rising prices are the end result of inflation. It's the effect. The primary cause is an increase in the money supply, unrestrained currency creation. So, I would suggest a better way to think about inflation is not to see inflation in terms of rising prices, but in terms of purchasing power. I believe that getting people to focus on the rising prices view of inflation is a psyop, a psychological operation. It's part of the perception management plan done so that people focus on the effect and don't consider the cause. Perception management is the name of the game because that's how our overlords maintain their power. Anyway, there is usually a time lag with regard to central banks increasing the money supply. As a real-world example, the Fed increased the money supply hugely during the pandemic, but it took a while for the effects to be seen in the real economy. We're living with those effects now. I should say that the best way to prevent inflation from occurring in the first instance is to limit currency creation and have governments be prudent about spending. And the best way to ensure this is to institute a gold standard. Central banks don't want this because it runs counter to their plans. It's no accident that Nixon's shock of 1971 ended the gold standard. This allowed the central banks to increase the money supply as desired. Governments were then given the green light to spend, and they did. This is all part of their long con. A British economist, Adam Ferguson, has said, open quotes, central bankers without exception all understand monetary theory. The fact that they ignore what they know is for political or economic or other purposes. They know what causes inflation, devaluation and depreciation of the currency. Close quotes. He wrote a book back in 1975 entitled When Money Dies, about hyperinflation in the Weimar Republic, Germany, circa 1923. Also, over a decade ago, he predicted that inflation would get bad like it was in the 1970s, although he couldn't say how bad it was going to be. He also talked about governments dealing with debt by means of inflation, so basically monetizing the debt. He says it's the only obvious way out of the situation that we're in today, and I agree with him. My only issue is that he should have called his book When Currency Dies, because there's a difference between money and currency. Central banks have created massive amounts of currency, which has caused the inflation we see today, and there's much, much more to come. They will throw money at each and every problem, and then there will be problems aplenty as we go forwards. So, alas, it would seem that we're headed for hyperinflation. I sincerely hope that you're all prepared. Rise up and rise up.